Mike Daisley, CEO of Mountain Safety Council, and I've been observing from the back is the best place to stand, and I've figured out it's about over here somewhere. And unfortunately standing right in front of Ben, so he can't get to see. When I was first asked and invited to come along and speak a little bit to this forum, it was around the change journey our organisation had embarked upon 4 or 5 years ago. And part of my own process is always to start listening to a whole bunch of other people. And so I started having a couple of conversations with different organisations within our sector in terms of change and the tasks that have been provided to me in terms of speaking to this audience. And a lot of the playback I got was, what do we need to change for? What does the organisation need to change? So there's this real sort of challenge that came in a bit of a reality in terms of we're wanting to have a conversation around change the journey our organisation went through, but a general sort of resistance or perception that there's no need for change. And the reality is, and everything you've seen in the room so far today, is quite the contrary to that. So there is every need to change. Change is constant, and the only thing that is constant is change. And this is not a new thing. This is some philosopher, Greek philosopher in 500 BC talked about life is flux and things are always changing. So change is a constant, and constant change is something you have to adapt to. And what we're hearing in the room, everything from this morning leading into this, has been the types of things that are changing in our sector and impacting on our sector. So clearly there is a need for change, and we've got an opportunity, and every organisation within our sector has an opportunity to either have change happen to it, or you get to drive a lot of that change and be the guider and leader of that own destiny. This is not something I've created, not even the picture, I stole it from Google, but is around this paradigm of always starting with why. This is something I've subscribed to for decades in terms of the role we've had within change. And it's become a little bit clearer, but if it's new to you, it's Simon Sinek, and I recommend Googling him, and he explains it a lot better in terms of the principles, but I'm going to try and do a little bit of a quick version of it here. And so there's 2 examples I'm going to use that lead into setting the foundation for the rest of this conversation, and it's around Mountain Safety Council is not in the same realm, league, or even the same decimal place as the 2 organisations I'm going to talk to, one being Apple and one being General Electric. But it's an easy way to explain some of the principles of always starting with why. And Apple as an organisation has a lot of people, there's an Apple product on my hand here, in terms of a lot of Apple engineers and Apple fanboys really lamented the change in Apple when they started making iPhones. They had a lot less concentration on computers, on big Mac computers, and started doing other things. Heaven forbid Apple had changed. Not if you asked Apple. They hadn't changed at all. Their why as an organisation they exist was clearly, I'm going to patch together their why, was around using technology to improve people's daily lives. That was why Apple existed. So it's very clear to them, it's always been part of their world and it's always driven their world. They didn't exist to make Mac computers. So when they started making iPhones and whatnot, that was just another iteration for them in terms of helping use daily technology and improving people's daily lives. So their why didn't change. The organisation hadn't changed at all, despite not really concentrating on Mac computers anymore. Ignore that. That's for the next one. So the second example was around General Electric. So their why is very, very different. And they started their life making little electric motors and just pretty much everything in terms of washing machines and vacuum cleaners is what sort of made them famous many, many years ago, and light bulbs. Now they're into weapons platforms, finance, software systems, and they still make engines and electric things, but they're made for gigantic turbines on warships, gigantic things that blow stuff up, basically. But their why, they haven't changed at all either. Their why is to return profitability to their shareholders. So whether you like it or lump it, in terms of this is a good example of that organisation, despite its fundamental change around making vacuum cleaners, light bulbs, and washing machines into weapons platforms and software, their why hasn't changed in any of that. It's to return profit to their shareholders is why they exist. And they'll do anything to fit that. So when it came to MSC, and in terms of this sort of space, in terms of change, is that did we change or did we change at all? And that's the sort of the question. We fundamentally changed in terms of how we were operating and the types of activities we were embarking on. But why we existed didn't change at all. We were, and always have been for over 50 years now, an organisation that was put in place by a desire to improve people's safety in the outdoors. And all we did was change how we did that. And that's sort of the subtle nuance, but not so subtle nuance in terms of what the rest of this conversation is about. So it depends really on your perspective. Did we change? Fundamentally how we do things, but absolutely not why we do things. So this call to action here is sort of when you hear some of the conversations going on from Grant, Jeff in terms of sport NZs, there's a bunch of stuff that's going on in their world. And this is change when it happens to you, and this is probably how, I'm not looking at saying Grant is like this or created this, but this is Grant's world right now in terms of you're flying along, building the plane as it's flying, and things are, that's a way of doing things, but it's what generally happens, not generally happens to, it happens a lot within organisational change. So if they haven't been particularly well thought out, or they haven't been particularly well driven from the start, so no one was really clear about why they were doing this. It also happens absolutely fundamentally every single time that change happens to you. So when things in your sector around your organisation change, and you're not ready for it, or you're not prepared to change, you're hunking down, we're all good, if it ain't broke, don't fix it type mentality. This is going to be you. Best laid intentions, skills active, very well structured, very well run organisation. Change happened to it, and here we are, Grant trying to lead this process in terms of what that starts to look like. Now thankfully, that wasn't our world. So this was more MSC, where we were building the plane as we were going, but this was way more conscious decision making. There was way more deliberate choices. There was way more planning and way more thought put into the process. So this particular image comes from an era, there's a gentleman here from WorkSafe, maybe block your eyes, an era of really, really long-term flying. So this was pushing the envelope of what planes were capable of at the time. But this was described our organisation better than the organisational change better than the previous shot. So this gent is standing on a little welded platform while the plane is cruising at about 2,000 feet. The engine is still running, but he's working on it as it's going. And then slowly building the plane as it's going. And that described the organisational change that MSC went through. So we spent a lot more time up front getting things in place and understanding things so we could make some more critical adjustments and real conscious, informed and quite deliberate changes to the organisation that were still quite fundamental. And what was really important for that was a couple of things. This graphic sort of speaks to me in a couple of ways. There's a lot of listening involved. But we listened, and I spent a lot of time travelling around the country listening to a lot of different people around what is it that MSC needs to do. I had the luxury as a new CE coming in by the board to say, by the council and by people within the sector to say there's pretty much a blank sheet in front of you. All we collectively know, the board and the council believed, is that the current approach wasn't working. It wasn't doing the right things in terms of improving safety of everyone going into the outdoors. But what that looked like in terms of being able to do that was the great unknown. There's a lot of time needed to be spent listening and listening to a whole range of people. And the critical thing in terms of projecting into change that any other organisation is about to embark on is being careful who you listen to. Listen to everyone, sorry, but it's be careful in terms of what you're hearing from those people. There's very quickly where I was able to establish a lot of people were quite vocal in terms of having a solution. Very quick to jump into that solution, what the MSC should be doing and what it should look like. But when you started to pick away some of the conversation, it was pretty clear that they also didn't really have an eye on what the problem was. Or the problem that they were talking about with the solution didn't actually match in terms of necessarily what the organisation, our why, was best placed to be in front of. So we spent a lot of time listening, and a lot of weak signals were picked up. So here were some things that I was starting to hear quite commonly around the country in different places. When you started to match up just a number of trampers, 1.5 million trampers regularly going into the outdoors, and yet we were doing some fantastic things with about 1,200 to 1,600 people a year. So 1.5 million trampers, and yet we were working directly with some, really well, with a much smaller number of people. And that was the big challenge that was in front of me. We had a fantastic solution, but it was a solution for a very specific problem. And the problem wasn't how to improve the safety of everyone that was going into the outdoors. It was a fantastic solution for improving the safety of the people that were directly within that environment that we were connecting to. And I did hear that a lot in terms of while we were doing things. So that we were at the time we were directly involved in building response capability, so helping response organisations like land search and rescue teams and a whole bunch of other people in terms of alpine rescue, in building up curriculum and training to improve that. Now, no one in this room is going to say that's a bad thing to do. It just wasn't necessarily the thing that we had to be focused on as an organisation. So there's another little nugget in terms of organisational things within our sector, and I think Jeff loosely touched on it a little bit. There's a whole range of things that need to be fixed, and no one's going to disagree with that. It's about being very clear as to where that fits within your own organisational focus, and there could be others around in the sector that are better placed to do that than yourself. And the example that Jeff used, if you're wondering, was around older age people in the recreating space. They're focused on youth. Others can pick up some of the slack in terms of the age and population, as an example. So we embarked not on change management. In the decades I've been doing this sort of thing, it's change management is what results in that plane being built as you're flying. If you've got that expectation that you can manage this process, you better land what you've got and start again. It's a journey, and New Zealand's great because we've got lots of places you can find a little journey and a picture to describe some of this. But we had a journey in front of us, and we had to work through that process. And we embarked on this massive fundamental change, realising a whole bunch of things. And one key thing is about 70% of all changes that are embarked on by organisations fail. So they fail in a whole range of different ways, but the typically when you're describing failure is that they fail to actually do anything fundamentally different to what they were doing before in terms of outcome or impact or changes into the environment they're trying to seek. The actual change happened, but the change that did happen had no final impact, so it ultimately failed. And so we knew that we had to, it was being if we failed in this process of our change, then more people were going to start getting into incidents and accidents in the outdoors, so people start doing some dying and some rather nasty stuff. So we didn't have an appetite for that failure. We're also within a sector where there's a lot of experts. This is not unique to the outdoor recreation sector, but we have an industry that's very expert driven and mixed in, quite thankfully, with a really volunteer-based or very passionate-based system. So not unique to outdoor recreation. I found a lot within the sports sector as well. We've got technical experts and a lot of volunteers, or a lot of very passionate people. Why I mention this is because that becomes another change or another complication within any change the organisation is about to embark on, because linking it back to starting with why, a little key kernel around that process of when you're working with technical experts or experts in any particular industry and looking to change the world around them and wondering why they're getting frustrated, or people that are really passionate around a particular thing and why are they getting frustrated with changes, you've got to remember why they're involved in this space. And if you're a volunteer and you've connected with an organisation and you're doing a particular role within that, you become very passionate. You're passionate about that thing, but the reality is, as that volunteer is really connected to doing the thing that they're passionate about, they're generally less connected as to what the organisation is trying to achieve, and very connected to the very specific piece that drew them into that organisation in the first place. They're very passionate about doing that thing. If you jump into a technical expertise world, the same sort of paradigm exists. So you're a technical expert in one particular field, and you become very, very focused on that thing. and less connected to what the organisation is trying to do. So a lot of frustration can come out and bubble out very quickly when the organisation wants to start doing weapon systems, and you joined as an engineer to make electrical things, to make things to improve people's safety in an environment, not electrocuting themselves with a vacuum cleaner. And you start saying, hey, this is wrong. I'm just going to get down, hunker down, and really build the crap out of this electric motor. But I'm being told I now have to design a weapon system. So that's why you can start to get some of these real disconnects and real frustrations in terms of a need to change and what you can expect to get from there. So why I'm sort of labouring some of this is that these are the sorts of things that you need as an organisation when you need to be changing at any given point in time, because it will be impacting on you. Some of the stuff we've been hearing about this morning is going to impact on each and every one of us in this room. So we are all going to have to change, like it or lump it. If we leave things too late, or we start to wait for things to happen, will be the flying plane, or your organisation, with that plane you happen to rapidly put things together while the whole thing is trying not to crash somewhere. It's better to do a bit of thinking when you have some time to think about it, and have some time to do some planning, do some really insightful things, and actually start to figure out why your organisation exists. And you don't need to fundamentally change that. Our organisation had replaced its why, improving people's safety in the outdoors, with a how. So how we're going to do that, and so there's no doubt that what we were doing was improving safety in the outdoors, but what had happened over time had become the organisation's why. Our organisation existed so volunteers could deliver safety training and outdoor training to people in the outdoors. That's a how, not the why we existed. And when I look around the room and the number of organisations that we directly work with a lot, we see this a lot. There's potential that your organisation's why has become confused with how you're doing things. So when an organisation or an education environment changes around you, there's an amplification of a lot of frustration very quickly, because what I'm doing, how I'm operating within the sector, suddenly is under threat. But if you take a big step back, often, and Josh isn't in the room in terms of, say, Scouts, was a good conversation there around when they step back, the why fits really consistently with a lot of things that are changing fundamentally within our sector. How they're doing things might need to change, but why they exist didn't need to change. So in terms of the very short version of why we did this and how we did it, was we still landed now 5 years later in terms of we can step back, I think, with a high degree of confidence and say the changes we made, because we took them deliberately, we took some time, we started to listen and really connect in terms of what we needed to achieve X, improving safety for 1.5 million plus people going into the outdoors. We needed to do things, how we needed to do that was going to be fundamentally different. But we needed to spend time and understand the problem first. And the problem was, how do we connect to that 1.5 million plus people that are recreating regularly in the outdoors, rather than, and then make some compromises in terms of how then can we improve their safety. So we look very different in what we do and how we operate in terms of using messaging, we drive our insights, and we work directly with our partners, which again, all those three things at a how level are fundamentally different to how we operated. But why we were doing it has remained the same consistently over that 50 odd years. And that's the thing, you can, as an organisation, fundamentally change how you operate, but as long as you're still consistent to why you exist in our sector, that's the hallmark of a good change process. So I'll leave you with that, start with why. Google Simon Sinek, and he'll explain it in terms of some of the process and some of the thinking behind it. And spend that time understanding what the problem is you're trying to solve with why you exist. And then it becomes very clear, I found, to understand how you need to adapt in a proactive way to that change that's happening around you.